dance and we will whirl. All children gather round. We will dance.
Hey guys, it's the Taproot Therapy Collective podcast, Discover, Heal, Grow, and today we're talking about the psychology of the katana, the Japanese samurai sword. So here with James Waits and with Alice Hawley.
Hi there.
And we're going to go through the psychology of swords. James has some personal stories and also advanced techniques he's going to share with us from his training. And Alice is going to go through some of the spirituality and the esoteric connections that swords share across culture. So I'm going to just jump into this quickly because we got a little bit of time today. I am a metallurgy nerd. Like my wife would tell you that I like knives, but I'm not like really into knives as much as like super purpose driven steels. I think are just kind of interesting that you can have something that is like as ubiquitous as metal, but it is as different as you can make steel. So I have a couple knives. I don't really collect that. I'm more interested in like different things. And so a katana is a little bit different than a Western sword. There's a lot of sort of amateur and professional like pseudoscience out there in that space, like about what katanas can do and whether or not they're magic. But so like if you look at something like this, that my webcam's not great, but you can kind of see the layers on the metal here and like the maker's mark on the side. And my webcam's trying to make it disappear. So this thing was covered in rust when we stayed at this like really cheap kind of tacky bed and breakfast in like Tennessee. And they had all these like Dollar General knives in the drawer. But there was one where I kept telling my wife, like, I think this one's like actually like VG10 or like white paper 1 or something. Like I think this is like a high carbon steel because a lot of the steels that Japan uses, they're forged and they're folded to kind of like laminate the blade with different metals. We'll get into like what that looks like with the katana, but they have a different texture. Like you can almost kind of feel, I don't know if it's the crystal structure or what it is, but there's like a slickness that's almost like fish scales to some of them. And this thing was covered in rust. Like I have it completely like sanded down now, but I asked the guy, I was like, I think this is like a really expensive knife. Like I don't want to, but it seems to be like going to waste here. Would you take like $30 for it? I think this is like a $300 or $400 thing, but I don't know. I could be wrong. And like he just said $400 is too much to have for a knife. And then he like took the $30 and gave it to me. So I cleaned it up when I came home and it ends up that it is like about a $350 Japanese like knife that's folded. So like the thing that makes the steel different, like this is probably like a steel like VG10 or white paper 1. Like when you deal with like Western steel, like from the medieval period, a lot of it is designed to be like durable and floppy. It's something that would be like similar to like what a modern spring steel is. Whereas, and it's not like vividly floppy, but you don't want to like hit a suit of armor and then have your sword bend. Whereas with the East, they had something called Damascus steel or Wootz steel, which you start seeing like in the history, Western history, when people are encountering it. And it essentially like they would throw just like a lot of grass and straw like into the Arabs would until like you started to get a ton of carbonization, and that carbonization is something that you can make the steel a whole lot harder. So when you make it hard, it's more likely to break because it is a lot more rigid, but it also can hold like a much finer edge. Like it can hold and so if you're dealing with a long like Arabic sword that you're going to swing from horseback or something, that's pretty useful. Whereas if you're going to fight a suit of armor, it may not be as useful. And so that's Wootz or Damascus steel. So the way that it's pretty amazing, like what Japanese smiths, because Japan, there's like some overlap with the rest of the world. But now like we basically know about the crystal structure of metals, that there's like crystals inside of these things that you were making, and that you can model that in 3D. You can figure out like what you can do to martensite to like add another atom to it. But obviously they don't have anything like that. So you have people that are basically just sort of like banging hot metal and folding it until they like discover incredibly complex things, which is kind of interesting. So the quick history of the Japanese katana is that, you know, you've got these swords that are relatively soft. They start to take on like a little bit of a curve, but when their Mongol invasions of Japan are happening, the king is like, the emperor is like, these things don't, and this is probably an oversimplified history, we don't have a good enough weapon. What do we do? and that one of the master forgers invents the katana and figures out, his name's Masamune. It probably is like a lot of different techniques that come together over time, but the pop history is that one guy just invents it in his shed and takes it to the emperor, which maybe that happens. And he says, that if you put clay along the side of the sword, you're going to get a harder edge because you're cooling it at different temperatures, and the sword's also going to bend. So the bend comes from the actual crystal structure diverging and pulling against itself, not because they just bent a metal rod in a katana. And then also he figures out a way to layer steels and fold them together so that you get the properties of both. So you can get a really rigid edge that if you made the whole sword out of that, it would shatter like glass. But when you're folding it in kind of a Z shape along the spine with softer metals, it's going to benefit from the flexibility of those. And so these are front weighted swords. Like they're not like balanced like a Western sword that you could really spin or something, because you're supposed to be playing. And James will probably go into more of that. Like with the momentum of these things, they're weighted about 6 inches from the hilt or the suba. So like a lot of these things have more to do with the way that you play with the inertia of it than just something that's, when you hear of a masterwork sword, you probably think it's like super wieldy, super well balanced. And when you first hold a katana, like they're kind of unwieldy. Like you're like, for example, like in Budo or Eido or Kendo, one of the drawing forms, like, you could be the strongest guy in the world, but that doesn't, and you could hit really hard, but that doesn't mean that you can necessarily accelerate something faster. Muscles tend to have like a set speed that enzymes can accelerate them. But when you're drawing the sword, you push it against the scabbard in kind of a triangle shape away from you. Oh. And you keep about 2 inches of the blade inside of the scabbard or the saya. So when you're pushing it out, you're getting this tension built up so that when you pull the scabbard off or the saya off, that blade is going to pop out with a ton of force. So it's like little tensioning tricks like that are kind of what make this a different style and a different psychology of fighting than the West. So that I've got a little bit more on some of the blacksmiths and the history there, but I'm going to turn that over to James to kind of go from there because he's got some stories. We'll break up the flow a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say I'm a freaking nerd when it comes to all this, and really just the history part. You're right. After the Mongol invasion, Masamune actually studied broken blades and was trying to figure out why are we breaking our blades against these invaders. They had a lot of shields, so you can imagine at the time that Japan was on majority horseback shooting bows and had long kind of like naganatas, which are staff swords, big staff, long blade, and it's
like a sword bladed spear, isn't it?
Yeah,
naginata.
Yeah, so it's just but very thicker blade all the way through, and some fitted that blade to actual sword hilts and used that on foot. But yeah, that was the primary primary fighting way of the samurai, especially when the Mongols invaded and they hit Tsushima and Ika Island or Iki Island. They got shocked. Yeah, the Mongols, they had bombs. So this is the first time that we saw kind of like in Japan saw iron bombs being thrown. They also fought people with shields and with like this crazy type of armor, heavier armor. And noticing that their arrows are bouncing off. Arrows are kind of bouncing off. The only way that they were able to kind of win some of the battles on those islands were the close quarter combat of just the rage of the samurai, or not necessarily the rage of the warriors back then. They even got wrote about was that a Japanese person with a sword is a scary thing after the first invasion. And that was written about them before I think they arrived back at like 1281. Again, we had a typhoon help out with the sinking of the Mongol ships before they landed on mainland Japan. But that was a crazy thing too. There was a lot of spirituality in that time. The shogun and the head of, I guess, the kind of the military-esque, not really a big shogun at that moment. But that was the spread of Buddhism through that, and it was the warrior way, Bushido. After that, that was what Tokimune. At the time, there was no solid thing, Japan, like solid religion or solid type of thinking way. We didn't see the samurai show up until after this moment in general. So a lot of the thinking from Buddhism and Zen and Shintoism were kind of the thing that creates the Bushido, like the kind of the warrior way at that time. So it's kind of broken up. You know, we get a lot of at the Mongol invasion, there's no really kind of like set in stone warrior delivery system until after the fact. After they redid all these things, created the katana. Masamune found a better sword. He created one. And you had the shogun at the time kind of transcend religion throughout the ranks. So he spread basically Buddhism or Zen through the warrior class. And so you have these kind of elite soldiers that come up from that. So you have the ones that are studying poetry, that are kind of meditating and finding their inner self, the warrior self, you know, the kind of the Bushido, their warrior way, a sense of like kind of some kind of essence of stoicism, except that you have them expressed in a lot of ways. You see a lot of samurai expressed through art, whether it's poetry, writing, even art, woodblock, all those things. So you have a really change in Japanese society in that moment, which is one of the craziest things about that time.
Well, and one of the things when we talk about like the psychology of the katana that you're hitting on that I'd like to hear you kind of talk to specifically, if you have a second, is like there are these sort of interesting tensions in Japanese culture, because I think we view it as like that it likes tradition, or that it likes authority, or that it likes like personal work and reflection in ways where when you really sit with the culture, there's kind of like an equilibrium to it. Like, you know, Japan has an emperor, but the emperor, and you have to show fealty to the emperor, and you have to show all this respect, and they're proud of the emperor, but the emperor really isn't that powerful. Like the shoguns actually ran the country, which continues into World War II, where there's still debate about whether or not the emperor was even really that important, or if it was the generals that were going to run the country, which they probably were. And so like that idea of being both an artist and a warrior, that you had to be both, or that somehow your art was informing the warrior culture. You know, so many of these things were like a response to limitations. I mean, the thing about the Mongol invasion that made the swords and the warfare have to change is that Japan is a pretty metal poor country. Like there's not a ton of metal resources, especially not accessible at the time. So when the Mongols came in, they basically had hardened leather armor that was just, it was boiled. It was probably chemically treated. It was woven differently, and it was like hard to cut through. And they also had iron plate, which there just wasn't enough iron for there to even be like what you would have seen in the Bronze Age in some places of Europe. In Japan, you know, almost closer to the Renaissance, there just wasn't enough for there to be like infantry iron armor. And that's what was breaking the swords, was that, you know, they didn't have the resources of these other countries, but what they did was they had this culture that was able to contemplate itself, you know, go inward and then come up with these creations. And then the culture is like still very proud of that. So, you know, could you talk about like in Bushido, the way of like, you know, and some of that's Taoism too. I think that idea that you have energy is really what's behind everything. So that same energy that is cultivated in art can also be cultivated in war. Or the energy that is held still in the body in meditation is also, you know, preparing to come outward through combat, things like that. I don't know. Because it seems like that's kind of what you're hitting on. I'd like to, you have more kind of practical experience with that than I do.
Yeah. No, you kind of learn. It's been forever since I did Kendo and Shin Kendo a good bit. About 10 years ago. And you learn a lot about the cuts or the kata that they go through, and they all are in some specific way tied to yourself and tied to your enemy. And it's really about the confidence in you. Your confidence, are kind of like your solid state is going to be the thing that overcomes the enemy. If you for a second think about, and we'll get to that when we talk about Musashi, but the thought of, could I lose this? You've already lost type thinking. It's really about you and yourself have to be confident in your sword. Your sword is an extension of you. And if you don't have no confidence down the line, you've already lost. And that's the thing with Shinkendo. The biggest thing in that's a type of martial art that is not necessarily like full on kendo, meaning that it's not you're not dueling the entire time. Shinkendo is more about your footwork, about the actual martial like art of stances, things like that. But the biggest thing, what happens at the end of Shinkendo, when you get up in rank, you do Toshimagiri, so test cutting. So you go up through the ranks where you actually have now access to a legit cutting sword. I think they're called Shinkins. Like you have Iaido, that's a blunted blade for kind of test swings. But everything, you're right, going back to what you said, Joel, that the whole thing of visualizing the sword is not the biggest thing. It's visualizing what's past. It's kind of like hunting. Like you look at your target, but you also look what's beyond the target. And same thing with the sword. If you think about cutting the thing in front of you, your sword is always going to get stuck in the thing in front of you. If you thought about how your blade just transcends through the thing in front of you, you let it flow. So Toshimagiri is crazy. I never got to, I'll be honest, I never got to full on Toshimagiri. I was able to practice indoors and not necessarily go practice at the Cherry Blossom Festival in Mountain Brook. But if you go there, you'll actually see on the stage every year in the Cherry Blossom Festival, the Shinkendo people doing Toshimagiri, which is awesome. Which started in test cutting. The helm splitting cut is the big thing that you learn, because it was the thing that could kind of strike through iron helmets at the time. And so when you get so good with following, the sword is a slicing instrument and not necessarily beating you up with it. So that was the whole thing, is like you had to make your sword slide through time and space through your opponent, and or whatever you're cutting. And it just goes like that. But you have to think about that. You have to psych yourself up. If you think, oh my gosh, am I going to cut through this tatami mat, which is what you use in Toshimagiri, you've already lost. You have to think about how you are going to go through this thing. And it's a lot of just, again, that's what the cuts and everything you do, is you are trying to flow through it. And it's all about just allowing yourself to calm. If you have a terrible grip, if you're too anxious and holding on to your sword, you're going to feel that sword's weight in your hands a lot more. If you, for a second, you think about how I'm going to swing this, and depending on what cut, the more mind games that you play with yourself, the more you're going to lose.
The idea of emptiness, of Zen, of flow state. We talk about artists and intuitives and trying to help patients tell the difference between their own kind of unconscious biases and trauma and flow state of intuition on here a ton. I mean, I think there's so much rich there to mine. Before we get into some of the history of the warriors, duelists, and the specific schools of like the forgers in Japan, I was wondering if Alice, if you have anything kind of about the nature of swords or any of that. I don't know if you've ever looked at like the death poem tradition. There's a really good book that I had for a long time. I think that it's disappeared from our waiting room at some point. But there's like a book of Japanese death poetry that like Zen monks would meditate and then come up with a death poem like during the last days of their life, that are haikus. They're very short and they're really pretty. I mean, some of my favorites are like, there's a guy that wrote one when he dies in a battle. They find it, he says something about like, this is a field of warriors. We are icicles melting, returning to the stream, just so simple. But and then there's another about like your whole life, you are a ship in a river, a paper doll drifting in a river that a child has dropped, but eventually the river reaches the sea. That kind of idea of kind of like energy and continuity that you find in a lot of those traditions. Alice, you do tarot. I know there's a suite of swords. There's also probably a lot of overlap with like swords and esoteric.
Yeah,
magic.
I mean, I think, and everything James is saying just directly flows. I mean, you're talking about energy and how it is implicit, like what swords represent and what the history of it, and especially listening to y'all talk about it. Swords isn't necessarily swords and metallurgy are not one of my special interests, but it's fascinating to hear y'all talk about the history and what James is talking about with, how you direct energy and the sword being an extension of you. And so swords are representative of air energy and our, air, water, and air, water, earth fire. What am I talking either? But they represent air energy. And so they always are about clarity and logic and intellect. And it's sort of the left side of the brain, the part of your brain that kind of focuses and uses that precision to be able to come to be able to like create thoughts instead of just amorphous feelings. It's like that sharpness of swords. That's the air energy that comes in. So yeah, they represent. And so then just in general, that's kind of what we get with swords. And then, yes, within the tarot, that's what the suit represents. And so with tarot, it's sort of you put down the cards and then you kind of reflect on like what they bring up for you subconsciously. And they all have themes and archetypes, and swords is one of the 4 suits. And it's one that represents air. But it also, so swords are also very much about like divine masculine energy coming in. So like the yang energy coming in, and that being like using your energy to like penetrate or externalize everything, which is what you're saying, like in battle, what you have to do is sort of like, not only is it like dialing in and grounding and like becoming one with the energy, but it's about turning your internal shield outwards and externalizing and like putting all of your energy outwards so that you're not, and that's like what you have to do to be able to engage in like a battle, is like put everything out. And I'm also thinking about so like athemas in like ceremonial magic or some traditions where it looks like a sword. It's like a knife-like thing. You don't use it to actually cut anything or do anything like satanic or something. But it's used to direct energy in ceremonial magic. And so so it would be made of some kind of metal. It has like a double edge, which represents like the polarity of the masculine and the feminine. And within ceremony, you might use it to kind of hold and like, as you're saying, like an extension of yourself to kind of point the energy out and like direct it and like put your intentions outwards. And they usually have like a black candle, which is all about like neutralizing the energy and grounding it. So, yeah. But I think, yeah, that, and then the metal itself actually like is sort of divine masculine representing too. That's like in the evolution of the planet, like when the metals came in, that was like when consciousness started to pierce the veil with the sharpness of those. It's all like this energy representation. But
well, and it is one of the first things that we do to demarcate society that went from sort of a nomadic pre-conscious or pre-collective conscious.
No, and that's spot on.
They start to forge early iron stuff. And Buddhism has some of that too, that's used for like cleaving, piercing, or scraping, but in a metaphorical way. I mean, some of those may be based on old tools. There's like the Kadaga sword or the Purva dagger, or there's a Kartika in my office, which is like an old like leather scraper, but they're so ornate now, you couldn't actually use them for that purpose. They just have this ritual significance. Like you're saying, you couldn't do a satanic sacrifice with any of these things. They're too ornate. Like the Buddhist fire swords have all this metal, fire basically around the blade, to reinforce that this is a spiritual purpose, not a metaphorical purpose.
Well, and what you were just saying about like the Iron Age and stuff, like that's sort of, I want to just emphasize that it's really interesting in like Eastern traditions. And when you understand like consciousness as a whole, what you're talking about the Iron Age coming in, that is that is literally why, like it was like the air energy coming into the evolution of consciousness. And that's why those metal ages started happening, and we're moving through these different yugas, which are like eras of time. And so that's like metals and swords and stuff are representative of this resurgence of the divine masculine energy coming in and creating like more thought forms and societies and systems and organizing things and things that penetrate energy outwards. So
which is
like
partly why, like, when I think we become nostalgic for another time, either in a healthy way or in a bad way, that can be kind of fascist or mythologizing like a past we can't return to. This sword is an image that we come back to, in good and bad ways, and healthy and unhealthy ways, through those movements, but not just recently. I mean, even going back to like the Crusades and things. I mean, there were kind of like older calls back to these things even when the weapons were modern. With Japan and the katana, like I'd like to talk about some of the duelists and the history of dueling, because I think that shows those tensions like really well. James has some stuff on that, and one of the things I think is interesting is like you think of the stereotype with these things is that the warrior meditates on the sword and thinks of himself as already dead, so that if he does die, he's not afraid of it. He's just in flow state, awaking from a dream, and that you're really cultivating this inward power by developing character, developing consciousness, developing knowledge, and then the sword becomes this extension of you. We think about it in that disciplined way of that you have to train for 100 years before you can even cut the mat, or a lot of people like to say, well, you could forge a sword in 4 years, but it took 15 years to know how to polish one, and these different kind of things from different periods of Japan. But a lot of these duelists were tricksters who were kind of gnarly and kind of defied tradition. Like a lot of the people who were the most successful actually broke their tradition and started to use like the wakizashi, the short sword. They would do a dual sword technique, or they would do something that wasn't quote unquote allowed. And so like that's sort of an innovative tension. James, you want to jump in there?
Well, I was gonna, start off with obviously Musashi as the stereotype, trickster, Ronin's, creating his own path, creating his own sword style. I want to dispel kind of the first things about it that Yoshikawa wrote the books that eventually became Musashi's novel, which influenced the samurai trilogy that we get as movie form. But one, Musashi did not fight for the losing side of the big Tokugawa, and he fought for Tokugawa during those days. So he fought for the winning side. Yoshikawa writes that Musashi fought for the losing side, but that's fiction that wanted to kind of drive the character of Musashi in defeat. But Musashi probably did not experience a lot of defeats, is what we know. That he was 16 when he would be fighting in those wars, which is crazy. Just think like he would have to go fight his dad. I loved Musashi, the book Musashi by Yoshikawa, but it definitely took some liberties on how Musashi came to be. What we do know is that he did follow a Buddhist monk that told him, you've got to reborn. You got to be born again in some way. And that's when he went from, I forgot this originally, I think it's to Takezo was his born name, and then he changed to Miyamoto Musashi. But that's what started his journey. So he is a trickster. This is the kind of juxtaposition of samurai versus the Ronin, which are just wandering samurai, which is kind of a class that was like you either had a bad master that died, or your master didn't, have anybody succeed him in such a way. And so there's always, that's what the Ronin type was, but you're still kind of in essence a samurai. You still follow this type of this living. Again, Musashi did write. He was an artist. He reflected a lot. We have a lot of his thoughts on paper,
but only after he was done. He sort of basically duels everyone who is around and kills them or wins, and then says, all right, there's no one left to fight. Everyone else is younger and they're going to study me. So I'm going to kind of go into a cave and write the Book of the Five Rings. Yeah.
But he also, even during his journeys, he had to figure out, he wanted to find out why he's going. I mean, that was the whole point of, and that's just through the book, is wondering, why does he feel, why is he longing for all these things? It wasn't the glory. It wasn't the battle. He just wanted to find what was going to make him kind of feel whole again. Mm-hmm. And so he had to incorporate a lot. But he's obviously a very interesting character. If you've read anything about Musashi, he was very crafty, very wily in that sense of making people late. He was intentionally late to a lot of his duels, making that he was causing that inner.
There's
turmoil.
A trickster psychology
to psych people out. Okay.
Yeah, in the Book of the Five Rings, or in the Samurai trilogy that James is talking about. Spoilers for 50-year-old Japanese cinema, but he went one of the last duels of Joel on Ganeshiro Island. He shows up late with a ore that he's chopped into a sword that he says he's going to fight with instead of his real sword, to kind of be like, I don't even need a sword to defeat you. He shines the light from the blade in the guy's eyes. He gets behind the sun. He stands in the water. He goes late to it. He appears to be maybe hungover or just like waking up from a nap, not caring. He does all these things to kind of enrage the opponent that you don't associate with the noble samurai meditating and then killing in a single slice. The most effective duelist really didn't do that. And when I forget I don't know the original Japanese for the style of swordsmanship that Musashi said he was doing, but a lot of those translations are something akin to doing what works or doing whatever it takes or doing what is effective, is kind of how he called his school of swordsmanship. And that a lot of that trickster innovative stuff is sort of at tension with the way that the tradition needs to live in the Japanese culture as being this timeless thing that is about nobility. But a lot of these guys were kind of gnarly, like James is pointing out. They did some psychological trickery and low forms of honor.
His style was called the school of the strategy of two heavens as one, which is wild. But yeah, going back to Musashi again, he was crafty. He one of his other famous duels was the final head of this one swordsman dojo is a young kid, probably 12 or 13. Musashi has already defeated, I think, the heads of this school once, and so it's transferred down to this kid who follows a family of swordsmen in this dojo. And of course, the school just wants to jump Musashi. And so Musashi just sits in a tree and just watches as they all gather, takes note, and it's just like, okay, this is going to be easy. And this is one of the only times in kind of his life that he actually used one sword and his actual bladed weapon. You see him all the time, so confident, and his skill, that's the whole confidence. He beats people up with boken or wooden boktos that he carves or finds sticks that he carves into a sword. But this was the one time he's sitting in the tree just watching everybody gather. He's knowing he's going to be ambushed. But to end the fight quickly, he just jumps down, sprints, draws his sword, and chops a little kid in half right off the bat, and then just runs away, beats a couple people up on his way out. Doesn't kill anybody else, I don't think. I think he might have killed a couple other people, but that was the quickest way to end the battle. He knew his target. He knew it wasn't, he's there to only defeat one person and not defeat 20. And so he just sprints right in as like a crazy person. Everybody kind of steps back and is like, what's going on here? Thinking that he would just line up and face, but instead he did what he had to and just ran in.
Well, and there's some speculation that he was like an incredibly strong guy, that he just had a lot more upper body strength than a lot of other people. And that also maybe he had a skin condition that isolated him or kept him like at the edges of society and not allowed into traditional. And that's a theory until he became so good at sword fighting that he had to be like entered into canon. I don't know if you can say anything about that. Because Miyamoto Musashi and Sasuke Kohiro, those are like the two duelists in Japan that are kind of famous, that actually are rooted in real people that are mostly real, even though we don't know everything about them. Even the people that had a root and history, like a lot of them turn into kind of myths, like Zatoichi, the blind swordsman. And then the opponent that, the last opponent that Miyamoto Musashi faces, even though there's not really a lot of history to it, like he has an odachi as a longer sword. And he kind of becomes a character that is depicted as like extremely feminine and sometimes almost like, transsexual or transgender in appearance. Do you know why that is? Like, I always thought that it was just like a compensation to Miyamoto Musashi's like masculinity, that he was like such a hyper masculine guy that they kind of portray his final opponent as more feminine. But I don't know if there's any historical reason for any of that, really.
I don't know. I think obviously that it goes back to a lot of people kind of painting Musashi as kind of rambunctious. I think they made up these stories of his a skin condition and things like that to kind of make him seem more relatable in a sense, because he was actually really good. Again, a lot of people want to paint him as a failure at the beginning, but he probably wasn't. He was good martial ability, which means like his attributes in other areas probably weren't so great. I mean, his how he related to other people, especially in writing, was just so bizarre. And thinking that, he ends up feeling normal, but you get to this point where one, he's not normal. He's a really good duelist, and they have to point something out or kind of come up with a reason why he's a bad guy in some essence, right? You know, he can't just be all good. And so, yeah, you have these things that he does this because he isolates himself. He's trying to battle a lot of these things or figure it out, but it's really, I think he just really wanted to find something that made him feel great. And I'm pretty sure Sasaki was his last. I think that was the last duel. I think he used a Odachi, and it was because he was paid. I think that's rooted in him being that effeminate. It was probably more so.
Flow state of water, or he was a more traditional duelist than Musashi, maybe
Traditional duelist, but also kind of wealthy. I mean, I think at this time he's being paid a lot to kind of coerce Musashi into a duel. Again, he was another famous duelist that everybody believed in, had heard of. No one really saw him fight before. They just heard stories, and I think that was also that kind of mindset of like the stories coming before the person of like, yes, this is our savior. Finally, somebody's going to take down Musashi. Here's a lot of money. And so you get that impersonation of like, just think about somebody who has been on the road as a Ronin for forever, and then someone who's getting actively paid a lot to take care of this problem. You get that kind of sense of this person's wearing a little bit more nice clothes. He's able to hang out with people, trying to figure out where Musashi is. And so I think they paint him in that light of very feminine, because he wasn't out there trying to beat people up or trying to find the next fight like Musashi was. He was just really, he only one target, and it was try to track him down and entrap him. And that's why Musashi knew that he wasn't about to be trapped. He was going to make sure that he made him pay for this. But after that, I think it wasn't fun for Musashi anymore. I think that was the reason it was one of his last duels, was because he had successfully, you never saw him really use his technique on anybody. Again, the wooden oar to the island after the dude's tired is a crazy story, but he carves his own sword and just bops him over the head and crushes his skull, apparently. But so you get the things. You have to find some way to demonize somebody.
The double swallowtail. I practiced that with my daughter with her wooden katana on Red Mountain. Yeah.
She's gonna go on a journey soon. Just start.
Well, we have a tea party and then a sword fight on the top of Red Mountain. So whichever way society goes, she's covered. If it's Downton Abbey or Fallout, we'll have. She's got all the skills.
But yeah, I think but I do think that's the reason why we paint. Well, a lot of people paint Musashi in such sort of way, but also hit that the people who came after him in another, because he was kind of too perfect. So in the sense of, he was really good at what he did. And then he wrote great books when he was done.
So he's androgynous at the end. Y'all are saying that's like how it culminates. And
probably not historically, but artistically, if you see people inspired by him in animes, anything, they're almost kind of transgender some of the time, or extremely feminine, long hair, long sword.
Because that also represents like the ultimate like enlightenment is coming back to androgyny and merging the divine feminine, divine masculine. Well, it's an Eastern religion thing, is coming back to that androgyny. I mean, and historical philosophy like Aristotle and stuff, but merging those two and becoming like one with chi, one with the universe, and then being able to like direct it all. So sometimes I don't think it's necessarily, I don't know that the history of the sense what y'all are telling me, but I don't think that like a androgyny necessarily indicates like a weakness so much as it might be just representative of enlightenment.
Yeah, I don't think it's from weakness. I mean, he's usually portrayed as a pretty powerful character, sometimes as like either the main antagonist or the main protagonist of like different kind of manga and historical, or based on history, traditions. I
think it had a lot to do with wanting external validation versus Musashi's internal validation. Like Musashi's always searching for this something that's within, and Sasaki was probably the one that's looking for that external. I'm the one who defeated Musashi. That's all he wanted to do. That's all he wanted. But for everybody to know that, going through town saying, I'm the one that's gonna fight Musashi, and it's just like, Musashi, I don't think remembers his name. Like that's the thing. He doesn't. He's just like, I don't know who you are, but they say I need to fight you, kind of thing. So it's
that was another kind of psych trick of being like, I haven't even heard your legend. I don't even know who you are. This guy's been paying people to talk about himself for a long time.
Yeah.
What about? I mean, I'd like to do an anime episode at some point with a guest if we find the right guest. But what do you think about the way that swords kind of, or the katana connects with like weebs, like people that kind of like mythologize it and turn it bad maybe, or just what do you think about that? Like generally like the cool guy that you were like kind of scared of but wanted to pretend you could fit in with, in my experience, when you're like in high school or early college, you like it's a little older, that drives like a souped up Mitsubishi Eclipse or has like Bala sharks, or like he was the guy that knew like all the strains of weed where it was like halfway made up, or like all the cool stuff you didn't know from your suburban identity. And like he knew all the katana facts and had the Book of Five Rings on his coffee table. I don't know if y'all had this experience with, but that was definitely a type of dude in like
it was.
Yeah.
Well, even in 2011, there was a guy like that who actually got me into it. I had jokingly, I mean, I watched anime, but you would always see like somebody slice through something like butter and it doesn't move and then slowly slides off. I saw this guy do that in person with a watermelon, and I was sold. I was like, holy crap. He just like got into this zone. He was like, it was a party trick at this point. He's just like, let's watch Parker, slice up this melon. And we would just go outside on his back porch and he would just like get into this zone. And the next thing
those guys are now, I wonder if it worked out for them,
Oh, it worked out for this guy. This guy, he's doing, he's a millionaire in Atlanta right now. So it's crazy. So maybe that's what that focus did for him. Maybe I need to get back into Kendo.
Good. Yeah, let's study the blade.
Study the blade.
So, and do you? What is it? And what is it? Kohiro had that concept of like no sword. Like he would do a lot of the fights where he would say like the best way is to avoid combat. And one of the guys, taunts him and is like, I want to duel you with your no sword style. And he's like, yeah, I'll duel you on this island. Come with me to this island. I'll show you no sword. The guy's like, yeah, fine. And he rows him out to this remote island, and the guy gets off the boat and he's like, bye. And he leaves him there for a couple days and doesn't duel him. And is like, that's how you duel no sword. So there's a lot of kind of like playing with like energy, trickster, culture, being capable at fighting, but also being better than needing to fight, I think is one of those big tensions you see in these stories. And those kind of energetic traditions echo like other esoteric practices. I don't know, Alice, you see any like parallels or anything? Because you had mentioned using like knives or swords in Western esoteric magic, like to separate things, cleaving things, directing energy. Not quite a wand, but it is a tool that shows up in a lot of different traditions. Yeah,
used in a similar way from a wand, but it can kind of redirect and direct intention is like what you're trying to put out there. And I think that's, when James is talking about like the strategy of, you're trying to not cut something, but like fully slice through it. Like you have to like get really clear on like, what is your intention and not get bogged down. Like, what do you want your life to look like? Yeah. Yeah. What
about tarot symbolism, the suite of swords, like any of you had mentioned air, but are there ways that like are there other through lines like in that suite?
Yeah, I mean, it's always, so like I was saying, kind of represents logic and clarity, like we're talking about. A lot of times in the sword suit, there are no bad cards in the tarot, but the swords ones can feel, and that's just like, you need to know that if you want to learn about tarot, there aren't really any bad cards if you're doing it right. But the ten of swords is kind of a tough suit. It sort of feels like that. And there are various cards where the swords do feel like more like they're kind of, to me, like representing different traumas and things like that. There might be, swords depicted, like the Six of Swords is a little family that's in a boat, like moving from rough waters to calmer waters. But they have all these swords still stacked in their boat. And so it's this kind of idea of they're maybe leaving this war-torn land, but they're taking all these weapons with them. So it's like it's like a father, a mother, and a child. So it's not like a battle thing, but they're moving somewhere safer. But, no matter what, you take the lessons that you learned, like the things that pierced and like cleaved your consciousness and like redirected your energy, and bringing that with you, even as you're healing. So there are different swords. I mean, suits of swords, cards within the sword suit that's kind of how swords can kind of be played with. Anxiety comes up a lot with it, because this is just things that are piercing your consciousness, of trying to, knowledge that you have that's trying to pierce through the veil and come into your consciousness, trying to like rise up into new awareness and new,
I always wondered if the sword, the Game of Thrones chair or throne forged out of swords wasn't inspired by that suite, because he plays with a whole lot of that idea that they're taking the swords and making them useless by making them a throne, but the throne is so inherently violent and corrupting that it sort of leads you back into violence and this sort of like slippery nature of the sword. I always wondered if Martin was playing with some of those ideas or if he just arrived at them independently in Game of Thrones.
I think it's interesting because a lot of times like he might have done it intentionally, but then there's just sort of, this is where, we get back into, there's these things that are baked into our consciousness, these archetypes that, we don't realize. And so as an artist or an author, you kind of, you play with and bring out these themes that are just these, universal pieces of fundamental knowledge, and you can find it everywhere, even if the authors and the artists didn't even know what they were doing. It's because it's from truth, it's in the flow.
Well, I know James has to hop off in a minute. Did you have anything you wanted to sign off or kind of like throw in at the end of there? Alice, do you need to get off right now, or can we run a minute or two over?
Yeah, I have. Well, yeah, I can do a few more minutes.
Okay.
Oh.
James, what you got?
I don't have anything to sign off on, except for, well, I don't have anything to sign off on, but
well, thank you. Did you see the Budo Academy open, like North Birmingham? You want to sign up with me? I was thinking of doing some classes.
Really? I
Physical
have a lot of time. I probably should. I need to get back into it, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm serious. Let's think about it.
Let's do it.
All right. Well, thank you. And
enjoy it. Look for my 11.
Got to go do the real art therapy.
Yeah.
So
move through it. So, all right, guys. Well,
all right. See you next week.
Peace. See ya.
Yeah, I don't know, Alice. A lot of the stuff with, like you're saying, or a friend of mine was did like graduate school work for a minute where he was like helping foreign students get engaged, and he was like telling me that a lot of times students that are coming from like Eastern traditions of India, Japan, China, like have a hard time with this idea of like citing sources, because they're like, well, that's a perennial philosophy. It's everybody's. It's just the universe's whatever. Why would I write down? You can't write down the first time that somebody came up with that.
Right.
And that kind of egoic idea of like Western inventor owns the knowledge and like whatever was like so at odds with that.
That's what you start to, once you kind of get deep in it, it just starts to feel like you kind of recognize like, oh, this, we attribute this to somebody from the 50s, but this is like 3,000-year-old. Somebody said it back here 3,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And that's sort of my beef with like Western science, is just sort of where we're kind of identifying all this stuff that's like literally in, the Vedas and stuff. They talk about all the, quantum physics and everything, and we never acknowledge, we discover things, but never go, oh, wait, okay, this is what they must have been talking about back here. Like, this is what this scientist was talking about. It's just interesting who gets the credit, like you're saying, for these like universal pieces of knowledge.
Yeah, I think that, if you invent a cotton gin or if you invent a new antibiotic, you probably, are the first one to come up with the way that molecule is connected together or something. But when you're coming back to these things that are in softer sciences about energy and, even, quantum physics, math kind of becomes a softer science at these upper levels. What do you, how do you, have somebody who has ownership or invention of that? I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to think. I had a thought back there, but can you say more about that?
I don't know. Just, well, with perennial philosophy in general, I mean, because we definitely bump up against a lot of that on here. I'm kind of two minds, because I usually try and say like, all right, here's the spiritual tradition, here's the anthropology tradition, here's the tradition where that gets bumped up against in psychology, and then maybe myth if that's relevant, or if it's separate enough from the anthropology,
right,
to try and let people kind of feel it. Because I feel like that's the best way of just kind of saying, yeah, a lot of people have worked in these spheres. There's, ways that you can make them more disciplinary, but the source of them is kind of interdisciplinary. But when I read authors that do the same thing that I do, I don't like it. Like, I'm like, oh, I get it. I know that, get to the point, so I don't know if there's like a way to kind of communicate that clearly, but I don't know.
Communicate that clearly. Yeah. Well, and I think, yeah, there's a lot to like even inventions, concrete inventions like you're talking about. Like there's so many cases where in history it's shown that like multiple people sort of right around the same time came up with the same invention or the same concept. And so it's really like, is any one person really inventing something, or is there, you know, in energetic understandings of like how the world works, like you might be tapping in, you know, people are actually tapping into collective knowledge that suddenly like put collective consciousness that's put these pieces together, and all of a sudden there are little individuals who like happen to be the right frequency to be able to like access it and then transform it into some kind of invention. So it's kind of always, you know, once you get into the nitty gritty, it's like who really, like I get into my head when I try to write, like trying to figure out how to say things in a way that nobody's ever said them. And then it just, all of a sudden it just starts looking like every single word is just a metaphor that somebody's already used. And like every phrase feels trite.
Well, and I think that holding the identity of the self that is, you know, individual, and then also like the collective is hard. You know, you kind of want those things to be in resonance, but you know, we do exist for a minute as an individual in the world. What do we do with that? You know, that's an old question. Yeah, and I don't know, just kind of put a cap on swords and the psychology of katanas. Is there anything else that you kind of want to get to, or do you feel like we've hit that as much as we can?
I feel like we've hit it. Yeah, I think just with the psychology of trauma, to just kind of reinforcing that the swords can represent, like maybe in the tarot, different traumas, and how it's like these things that directly impact and put us into fight or flight and then keep us there. It like becomes this like force that can, sometimes it collapses like your reality in ways that gives you these awakenings or things like that, or just profound knowledge. And it's that swords coming in and piercing through like your individual, all your neurons and everything. It's coming in and piercing through all of that. And
there's probably a good metaphor to be made, like from parts-based psychology, like the idea that like we're noticing all these parts of self and our multiplicity, but that when we bring them together and don't over-identify with one, we're actually more than the sum of our parts. In the same way that you're stacking, you know, like a soft metal in the middle of the spine, you know, a medium metal, and then laminating in a harder metal, and then reinforcing the tip to make martensite, you know, and then this whole sword can now cut through things that glass can cut through, but it's not as rigid as glass. It's flexible enough to last through the battle. You know, something probably there about the folding of steel and the forging of the soul also is relevant. And
and that is swords that forms the ego, and so that is like where we see trauma and people split, or just any of us. I think it's like, I think everything, you know, like that's on a spectrum as well, like how much we're dissociating, how much those swords have really, like the traumas have come in and like split us into different parts. And it's about trying to kind of like come back and like own that energy and come back to center, even
like people you deal with that have been cut off from personal power, that are sort of like under-identified with their own agency or their own voice. A lot of somatic practitioners talk about that showing up across the arms and in the center of the chest, that a lot of times when you try and get them in touch with like their right to self, they feel a black hole sucking, you know, in the heart, and you want to replace that with like a warmth or light, and, you know, kind of meditate on that feeling of power. But I mean, that is kind of the warrior archetype. When you're holding a sword, you're holding it, you know, with your arms in front of your chest. And a lot of the people, when I'm saying, okay, you're really over-identified with the magician, you're trying to understand everything esoterically, you're trying to understand everything as a system and passively, but you need to be more comfortable with your ability, you know, because of trauma, you've been cut off from this ability to just say, this is me, I'm visible, I have a right to this conversation, I have a right to self. And standing upright, you know, getting people in touch with that warrior archetype. A lot of them imagine themselves holding a sword or holding a shield.
And in like hatha yoga and kundalini yoga and different practices, some of my favorite in kundalini yoga tradition, you put your arms up like that, and then and like with your fingers kind of pointing to the edge of the room. And hold it like that for 3 minutes to, anywhere to like 11 minutes or something, depending on how much. But it's basically, but what's interesting is that as you're holding it, the idea is that your shoulders and your arms are really strong enough to let you do that for that amount of time. But there's this psychological thing that happens where it just starts feeling like I can't do this, I can't do this, I can't do this. But it's because we store, that's like where we somaticize like a lot of these feelings of that weight on our shoulder and powerlessness, things like that. And so as you meditate in some of these postures, another one is like where let me back up and then I'll come back to me, but where you're like up like that, and I'm holding it like this up at the top. But that's like direct, and you hold your fingers directly up and you're just completely concentrating your energy and pushing down into the earth and like directing up at the top. And so you're doing the same thing with your body to be able to direct the energy, turning yourself into like that sword sort of.
Is the arms up? Is that what you call sun salutation, or is that something different?
That's different in these type of, in hatha yoga and kundalini. I can't remember what we call it. I can't remember what it's in a bunch of kriyas, but I can't remember what it's called. And
that's interesting. I think that that idea of kind of like power being in the center, the warrior archetype, being kind of identified with the sword, that we have a right to our own kind of individual voice or power. We come back to that in a lot of different somatic traditions, because it is the way that you assert individual power, whereas like there's a lot of kind of more mystical pathways and to understand things intuitively, but the sword is not really about as intuition as much as being able to actualize something,
Yeah. And it's about, what you're saying in swords. I guess the keyword here is also swords are about truth. And so when I'm showing you, like, and you could do this, anyone could do this, but sit in lotus or sit crouching on your knees and do the one where you're holding your arms, your fingers like this. And this is a mudra that I can't remember the name of. And then you hold your arms up. That one, as you're doing it in certain kriyas, you're reciting Sanskrit words, sat nam, which means the truth is in me. And you're just saying it like over and over and over. Sat nam, sat nam, sat nam, sat nam. I'll just do it for like minutes. It's like the most empowering thing because you like feel it in your diaphragm. But it's just telling your body these tones like resonate with our soul. Like, so you're bringing your energy in and penetrating it out into the world and saying like, the truth is in me. I am the truth. I am the truth. I am the truth. So it's all about like, I am powerful, not giving away your power, not saying I'm just a tiny drop of water and blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, I am truth. It's in me. And I think that's what swords, when we're talking about clarity and things like that, it's about what is really, really true.
Well, my wife has named her katana. I gave her a katana for Mother's Day, and she knows German. She's of like Czech descendancy, and she also is a teacher. So I was holding out for like a name like Edelweiss or Teacher's Glance or something, but she named it Final Lesson. So that's on the wall in our library. She's got a kind of it's traditional, but it has a flower kind of rose mulling painting on the saya. So I don't know. I was hoping you could do it up there, but I didn't have time to set up the computer. Well, that's good. I'm sure you've got stuff to get to. You got anything else? Or you want to sign off on the psychology of swords? All right.
Yeah. No, this was fun.
We will see you guys next week. Thank you so much.
Thanks.